All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of What's What BR. We have a first-time guest. We have Dr. Craig Greene with. How are you, sir?
Hey, good afternoon.
Appreciate you making some time for us here. So, might be confusing people, but not only you're orthopedic surgeon, but also wear a couple hats here in town, correct?
Yeah, I believe in citizen democracy, so I think normal people ought to be in politics for as long as possible. So I'm taking my turn, and after this, we might be voting for Brandon. We never know.
I've had some people try to talk me into that, and I think the safest answer for myself and everyone else is no. No, like that's a hard pass. So tell me, I guess, what's the day job orthopedic surgeon? I think we get that, but the other day job with the Public Service Commission, I guess, what's the normal day in the life? What pulled you into, the Public Service, Commission side of things? I don't know if a lot of people realize what this is and how important it is. So,
yeah, I still get asked if I'm on the school board or didn't know, people don't even know what we do. And we're probably next to your house note, your utility bill is probably the next biggest one, and people don't even realize it. So there are 5 commissioners. There's 1 million people in my district, and so we have a team of people that mainly field complaints about whatever. They can't get their electricity turned back on, or maybe they don't like their bill, and so we're who you reach out to for those type situations. And a lot of times we can help. These big monopolies, they're often not suited for customer service, and we're trying to push for them to be more to do better at customer service, but they're not there yet. So we're the avenue for that. And what we do, because most of them are monopolies, we set what they are allowed to make. They have to be able to earn a fair rate of return, but we're also looking at ways how that could be different as well.
And that comes down to, I guess, from kind of, as you said, this is the kind of break it down if I had to describe it, it would be, for people to think kind of the electric company. You've got one set of power lines that run to the house, and the guy who owns the power lines gets to, in theory, he could charge whatever he wants for it, but you guys are there to kind of regulate on top and say, no, you can't just make up whatever you want to charge per kilowatt hour, on your own, right?
Yeah, because it's a monopoly, it's so cost prohibitive. If say me and you, Brandon, wanted to start our own company, the startup cost for that, the barrier to entry is just so enormous that the people that have it already are the ones that are going to be best for them to keep doing it. But if they're the only ones, you're right, they could charge whatever they want. And that's where we come in to regulate them and deem what it is that is a fair amount for them to make. And of course, they're always arguing that they need more. And we're trying, our goals are threefold, really. We want, first of all, reliability. We want the lights to come on, the air conditioner to come on, the heater in the winter. The second, though, is affordable. And, we're the poorest state in the union. Many of our customers, our ratepayers, are on fixed incomes. And so you get a bump, that cuts into their living expenses every month. And the last, which I think is an emerging one, but very important, and that is sustainability. So we make a decision through the lens of reliability, affordability, and sustainability.
And how does that work? Do you guys get involved, as well on some of these, like the surcharges, like the Katrina, the additional cost when they come in, or are these companies able just to kind of decide what they want there, or do they still have to come back to you guys to some degree?
No, they absolutely have to come to us. So they figured out even before I got there, the best way to do that, let's say, for instance, the most recent round of storms are probably going to cost between $4 and $5 billion for the state of Louisiana. And so these companies traditionally, they get a return on whatever they spend. Well, this is a catastrophic emergency. And so for them to be able to earn 9.5% on 4 to 5 billion, there's got to be a better way. So what they came up with, which is the best way, is a bond mechanism to where a bond is issued for that amount. And, for Katrina, it'd probably save between $600 and $800 million of what it would have cost otherwise. And for this, it's going to be probably close to $1 billion in savings in that way. So the best case would be if the federal government would fund some of this. I mean, in my opinion, they're going to possibly send another $33 billion to the Ukraine. And what they're doing there is very important, but could we get 1 to 4 billion for Louisiana for almost losing our entire electric grid? That would be quite helpful.
Yeah, I'm all for helping as many people, but I think you got to put a priority, right? Like let's fix what's wrong at home first. And then if we've got
Agree.
something left over, then let's go push it, out there, because like you said, it's our electricity. It's a grid here. That would make sense, right?
And I really believe that, let's say we're talking about New Jersey instead of Louisiana. I'd be okay with that too. Let's take care of New Jersey before we take care of the Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm with you. Some people may not think it's popular, but I think I think we have to be realistic, because at some
who knows
point,
where the end of quantitative easing really is. So if you're printing it, just send us some too.
Exactly. So tell me now, we've talking a lot about energy, but this is, electricity, water, wastewater, gas, pipeline, it's a lot more than just the electricity at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's electricity, water, wastewater, gas, towing, motor carriers, pipelines. And then really, we don't enforce all of these, but we regulate them. And what that looks like is you have a generation. Like generation would be, is it a coal plant, which hopefully those are going away, or is it natural gas? Those have been very good for a lot of reasons. There's nuclear, there's solar farms coming out now. There's a lot of chatter about wind, but that is the source for the electricity. Then you might see the really big lines that maybe go across the field, or they go across Lake Pontchartrain. Those are transmission lines, and those are very high voltage, and they can get it from the generation plants to what's then called the distribution grid, and that's the lines that we have outside of our house. And so the transmission and distribution, those are there. They might blow down, but we're going to try to figure out how to put them back up better. Possibly underground, or how can we be more resilient is something that we're asking a lot of. But these generation plants are often, they're 40, 50 years old. They're paid for. They've got to be decommissioned. And then the next step is to ask, well, what should replace them? And arguably, if we get to more efficient use of electricity, and we can get something that's, I think the natural gas plants and the heat rate, which is the efficiency at which they convert natural gas to electricity, has become so good. That's been one of the leading factors to decrease the carbon emissions and CO2 emissions. And so I think natural gas is really suited well for providing us for those. And then the question is going to be, who pays for those? Do we pay for them? There are outside companies that are wanting to start paying for them, and that involves what I refer to as risk transfer. Who's taking on this risk of building a new power plant? So we're exploring all of those options.
And so you mentioned that, we watched, I guess, was it a couple of years ago over in Houston, they had the big freeze over in Texas, and, their whole grid kind of went down. Do we have some of that same risk, here? Not necessarily of a freeze, but is it, I don't know I think people take a lot of granted for being able to walk in and flip a light switch on. And we all understand when the storms come in, but there's a massive amount of infrastructure that's got to make that happen. And I think people don't realize what's involved.
Yeah, so absolutely. If you look at Louisiana in the last, 6-7 years, we've had the flood of a century, the freeze of a century, 5 named hurricanes. I have a camp in Fouchon. Winds registered there 196 miles an hour. We had sustained temperatures below freezing for 4 or 5 days. Just things that, how much could you plan to make that never happen again? And I think you have to balance that with how much would it cost to achieve that, and who's going to pay for it. And so, I don't think Iowa or any other in the Midwest have all these hurricane problems, but they've certainly winterized their grid a little better than we do. So the question is, it's going to be 100 degrees between now and October. How much do we really want to winterize it for a once and how often freeze we might have? And I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle. How can we do better for the cheapest possible way of doing better? What lessons can be learned from Texas and from Ida and from Katrina? If you look at it, a lot of people would say, "Oh, just bury everything." Well, if you bury everything, that that's fine until there's a water event. And Katrina was a water event. And so
Mhm.
you don't want things under the ground if there's a water event. Well, if there's a wind event, maybe it is better to be underground. But then you start looking at underground and you think, well, how many trees are we going to have to take out to put everything underground? And how expensive is it to fix something when something underground goes? So we've actually hired engineering firms to help us answer this question on a very granular level moving forward. How can we do better? How much would it cost and how long would it take?
Yeah, I think that's, I can remember, a number of times you'll see, when it's above ground, somebody's being run over on the energy side, just pop that fuse back in and get you back up and going versus having to dig everything up. We used to call it when I was in the IT world, you could spend as much money as you wanted backing up data and redundancies of systems. But what it really came down to, we would explain to people like, look, we can go all day, but let's start with, what's what we call a recovery time objective, like how fast do you need it back? And that's going to determine how much money, like if you're willing to be down a day, is that okay? Because we don't need to spend all this money to get you back up in 45 minutes versus, it's that middle ground, I think is kind of where you're talking about of, what's
And
important.
the way I think about exactly what you just said is, let's say everything blows down tomorrow. Well, the priority becomes how quickly can we get everything back on? That is not the time to sit and analyze to say what should be underground, um, what should be above ground. Should we put the most expensive poles possible? What I think that takes is 3+ years of planning, and then it's rolling it out in an iterative and affordable manner.
Now, when you say affordable, like you said, that's the whole question of still who's paying for it and what's it, needs to be done. And that's probably a decision for people smarter than me to kind of figure out. But, is there any other ways that you can think of that this could be done? Do you see other, municipalities or areas that are we still in the same, we're generating power, transmit, distribution, that's the three possible or the three main ways of doing things. Is any of that changing, that you can foresee? Is it making smaller grids or, is it these are priority grids, those kind of things?
Well, if you think of the utopian situation, I personally think it would be small stackable nuclear and underground microgrids. Now, if we scrapped what we have now and went to that, it would probably be 100 times more expensive. And who knows how long it would take to roll that out. So, going from utopia to better than we are now, if we think of that as a spectrum, and how can we gradually get better? And then to think, I kind of think competition breeds excellence. And there's a lot, even look at what Elon Musk wants to do with Twitter as far as making it open source. I think involving more people, more public, more professionals in this conversation is far better than just doing everything the way we've always done it.
I think that's the key. I think there's a lot of times, I know we do that at our company, is we always have to ask, why, challenge the why of why we do different things. And just because we did it this way before doesn't mean we need to keep doing it, that way. And so
I'm a big believer in two things: cognitive dissonance and also confirmation bias. And so politicians are terrible at this, doctors, probably just most people in general, that when you make a decision, you just start doubling down on why that's the right decision. And I think what we should do instead is ask the question, well, how could we be wrong?
mhm.
What could go wrong here? And then that's called hypothesis testing. And then if I'm comfortable with my hypothesis, I should let everybody else test it too.
Right.
And then if we find out something that could be wrong, well, then, okay, let's make that better. So I think that we should have that approach, and also to learn that, let's say the first round might be better but not perfect. Well, let's learn from those mistakes and keep sharpening it.
I've always said progress, over perfection. Let's just get there. If we sit there and wait until we have the perfect model, filled out, we're never going to get there.
I heard a quote recently. It said, it's better to have some of the questions than all of the answers. So I just think we keep asking questions until we get to the most refined answer possible.
I think you're right. And I think that's what a lot of people need to, people need to figure it out. I've got on my desktop, literally on my computer right now, there's a quote, William Pollard said, the arrogance of success is to think what you did yesterday will be sufficient for tomorrow. And I think that's so true, that we can't just sit there and say, yeah, we were all did great. This grid or everything's worked perfect. Let's just keep running. Those copper lines. Somebody's got to sit there and go, but why? Like what's the next step, and then
Well, and
break it apart.
a lot of the things that we're looking at, Brandon, we haven't looked at since before there was an iPhone. Think about that.
That's Yeah, I think, what is it? Somebody told me it's, not the same correlation, but like when you go look at schools, if you go look at a classroom now, the way somebody described it is funny. You go look at a classroom from 1930 to a classroom right now. By and large, it's pretty much the same. The desks are in rows, the teachers in the front, everything's pretty much the same. But if you go look at, a phone, then and now, like everything's changed. Like we have to be able to, I think, challenge and, say like, well, how can we do better? What is the other option? Is the best line putting a pole in the ground and running, copper down it? Like, can we do smaller? Maybe that's what you're referring to, smaller substations and neighborhoods. And then how do we do these different things? But how much of that falls on, I guess, you guys in the PSC or, the distribution and transmission, like those guys, like they've got to have a, they don't want things to break, right? They want it to work all the time and things, but is it you guys kind of, is that the iron sharpens iron a little bit where you're kind of pushing on them? And
Yeah, I mean, well, the iron sharpens iron is we have to approve their rates. So otherwise, I don't think they would listen to us. But also, we're looking at, I have a pole viability docket. So how can we make the distribution poles more resilient? And at what point when they're leaning, do they need to be fixed? Do you have to wait for them to snap in two before we fix them? But do we just, it's kind of like Jack Welch, do we just find the bottom 10% of poles every year and replace them? How much would that cost? Who pays for it? Over what time period? Same with transmission. The transmission structures that were supposedly rated for 150 miles an hour wind, were they? So what about the ones out there that aren't right now? So we just start replacing those, and then everybody should expect to see that reflected on their bills. One of my opinion too is that people don't mind paying a little more if they can see what it's going towards. If they see that, like, gosh, we had a storm and my lights stayed on, or that pole looks good, or the transmit, nothing failed in this bad storm or freeze, then they kind of very proud of the grid that they have. What people don't like is when they pay more, they think that it might go to some shareholder's profit and they lose their power in the middle of the day. That gets to be problematic, and I understand why. So part of us is holding them accountable. So say we allowed you to spend this much money on vegetation maintenance around distribution lines. Well, show me your work. Did you do it? Which ones? How much did you spend there? People just want to make sure that the money they're paying in electricity doesn't go toward people flying around on private jets. They want to make sure that it's going towards keeping electricity on.
well, I'm thinking you probably have, it's one of those things where when it's working, nobody calls to say thanks. Just want to let you know everything's great, my power's on, things are wonderful. You get the call when it's always, it's down, or there's a problem. And that's, we're talking a lot of high level stuff here, but like you said in the very beginning, you're also fielding that call of, someone who's maybe saying, I've heard stories of businesses to where it's like, there's no reason why I should have this high of a bill. It turns out, that they were in a shopping center and somebody else was wired into their, building, and, but that happens in the home too, I guess, maybe sometimes, to where it's like, hey, this doesn't seem right. And it's like, well, if you call that power company, then they're not as likely to go, let me send somebody else to take a look. Yeah.
I think the other thing to factor in is what they do is very difficult. You think about, there's a storm rolling in 150 miles an hour, and think about how brave these linemen are that are coming from Florida or Tennessee or wherever, and they're going to go out in the middle of it and start working. And so we should tip our hat and give a lot of thanks. And I think most people do. It's just a breakdown from when you pay the bill to see where it goes and what all goes into keeping the lights on. And I think, say we get to more efficient use of it, whether it's better light bulbs, better everything. Perhaps we could use less of it, but certainly that's not been the trend. The trend has been we're building more structures, people are using it more. Of course, with the internet, now you have crypto mining, which has increased the usage of electricity. So I think we have to be ready to embrace all three of those: reliability, affordability, and sustainability.
It would seem, is this, oversimplifying a problem, and I guess, I'll probably leave you with this, but it would seem, as a private business owner, not in a utility, but like I would, if I ran the company and I had people, obviously when people lose power, they get very upset. I would have on that monthly bill every single month, like, here's your uptime. Like your electricity has worked 98% of the time in the last 12 months. Like, it's, if you gave that rolling average, just to kind of put a little perspective to it, it's like, we all know it's horrible when it goes out. Nobody
Right.
likes it, but it's like 98, 99% of the time,
Right.
it's working without a problem. It
Well, I
seemed
think
like
that's a
that'd
great
be a
idea.
good.
See, maybe you would make a great commissioner one day. I think what people want, and I believe in transparency, and I think in accountability. And I think if we can give them as much information as possible, such as that, that helps. And to your point, the 1% of the time or whatnot, I used to tell people when I had a winch on my truck, you don't need it until you do. And
Right,
the 1%, it probably happens at very inopportune times. And so the
Mhm.
other thing with these power companies, and maybe even people perceive the Public Service Commission this way, kind of like the trash man. He only gets attention when he messes up. But if he does
Yep.
his job, no one really ever notices, right? And
Mhm.
maybe that's the way it should be, but this is a very monumental task that so many people are trying to tackle. My goal is can we make it iteratively better? It's not going to be this magnificent swing where things are suddenly different, but over time, can we make it gradually better?
And you know what it might be? And here's, I know you've got some places to go, but I'll throw my last idea at you that just came. Maybe it's people, the way they feel. Like, I believe perception is reality, to where at the end of the day, if I've got let's just make it, and on average, I've got a $200 electricity bill. Well, my power goes out. If I had that percentage that tells me on the bill, this is how much it's in. But then also the same kind of way the federal government handles something like the airlines, in the effect where, like, if you're sitting on the tarmac for so long, these airlines are having to write credits back. It's like,
Yeah.
hey, you kind of got a penalty. So it's almost like, I don't know what it is, and I'm not one to go in and start penalizing big companies, but it might ease some of that to where it's like, because when you lose your power, right, you're not spending any money. So it's not like you didn't spend anything extra, you didn't pay for it. But if it was like, hey, if you were out of power for so long, maybe they get a little credit, when it comes back up. So they feel a little bit different. Like, the perception's like, hey, I got $20, because I was
There's a
down for
bill in
3
the
days.
legislature right now, because that's surprisingly, that's been a fight in the past to say you got to give them credit for the time that they weren't using it. And
Mhm.
people are shocked. But there's a bill in the legislature now to make that automatic. Now, technically, given the Louisiana Constitution, that's got to come through the Public Service Commission, but I think it's a great idea. You should automatically not pay for what you didn't use.
Right. Let it be. And I think people would, it would ease, like I said, that perception where it's like, hey, it worked 97% of the time this month and you were down, but hey, we don't need to be writing checks to everybody, but it's like, hey, here's a credit on next month's bill
Yep.
of, $26, for what you had to do, for maybe that covered some bags of ice and took care of some stuff in your refrigerator, here you go. And then you get people that are not near as mad, and they're a little
That's
more
right.
understanding. So,
That's right. Well,
well,
Brandon,
sir,
I've
I
enjoyed
appreciate.
this. We should do it again sometime. Thanks for
Yeah, no,
making. I want people to know as much as they can about all this, and our office is available to help, and we're open to ideas like you had. So keep them
well,
coming.
absolutely. Well, I appreciate it, sir. You got more important things to do than talk to me all day. So I appreciate you
No,
carving out some time.
anytime.
And we'll catch up later. We'll have you
Take
back on
care.
for sure.
Bye, man.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.